everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Patience. So today I am going to be making this beautiful halter-neck dress. Before we get started, kindly click the subscribe button. If you have done that, let's get into it. So I'll be drafting the front piece on this pattern paper, and I have marked my shoulder line where I'll start my measurements. So the first measurement I'll take is half of my armhole measurement, which is 8 inches. And then I'll mark my shoulder to bust point, which is 10.5 inches. And I'll mark my shoulder to waist measurement, which is 17 inches. And I'll add ½ inch that I'll use to join the lower part, that is 17.5 inches. So I'll label this as the chest line, the bust point, and the waist line. So the next measurement I'll take is half of my shoulder measurement, which is 8 inches. I will not be adding ½ inch. So I'll mark 8 inches on the chest line and I'll connect it. After doing that, the next measurement I'll take is my bust span measurement, which is the distance from one nipple to another. Mine is 8 inches divided by 2 is 4. Then I'll add ½ inch, that is 4.5 inches. So I'll mark 4.5 inches on the waistline and the bust line. And on the bust line, I'll come down by 1 inch and I'll connect it from the 1 inch to the waist. Now I'll be using 1 inch for my dart, so I'll mark ½ inch on both sides and create my dart. After doing that, I'll be taking my circumference measurements. So on the chest line, I'll take my bust circumference, which is 42 inches divided by 4, that is 10.5 inches. And I'll add 1 inch for sewing allowance. I'll mark the same measurement on the bust line, and on the waist, my waist circumference is 36 divided by 4, that is 9 inches. I'll be adding this 1 inch for that is 10 inches. So I'll mark 10 inches and I'll add 1 inch for side seam allowance. Now I'll also be adding a side dart. So from this bust point line, I'll come down by 1 inch this way. And also from the bust span measurement I took earlier, I'll go in by 1 inch. You can also go in by 1.5 inch if you like. So I'll connect this 1 inch to this 1 inch. So I'll be using 1 inch for my dart also. So I'll mark ½ inch on both sides and I'll create my dart. Now I am going to be taking in this dart, so it will affect the length of this bodice. So I'm going to add back the 1 inch this way. Now I added 1 inch, so by the time I take in the side dart, it is going to replace the 1 inch for that. So that is it, guys. The next thing I'm going to do is on the chest line, I'll come down by ½ inch. You can come down by 1 inch or 2 inches. It depends on how deep you want the armhole to come out. So for the width of the neck, I'll be using 3.5 inches because I don't want it to be deep. If you want the armhole to come out really deep, you can use 2 inches or 2.5 inches. So from the 3.5 inches, I'll come down by 1 inch this way. And I'll make a straight line. So this is like my new shoulder line. I will not be using this one anymore. So from this 3.5 inches, I'll make a slant line to this ½ inch that I took earlier to create my armhole. So the next thing I'm going to do is to mark my neck depth. So I'll be using 2.5 inches for the depth of the neck. That is for the front piece. So I'll make a curve this way. Remember, I marked the 2.5 inches from this new line. So that is it, guys. Also, I don't need this line. So my pattern is ready. I'm going to cut this out. So this is the front piece, and I will not forget to extend my dart to the 1 inch I added. So this is it. I extended the dart to the other side of the bodice. So remember, I'm going to take in the 1 inch this way. So that is it for the front piece. Now for the back piece, I'll be using this pattern to draft the back piece, and I left 1 inch for zipper allowance, and I've also marked my shoulder line. Now the first measurement I'm going to take is the armhole measurement, which is 8 inches. And then I'll mark my back half length, which is 15 inches. And then shoulder to waist, which is 17.5 inches. So this is the chest line, the back half length, and the waistline. And I'll mark my shoulder measurement on the shoulder line, which is 8 inches, and I'll do the same on the chest line. Now I'll be taking my bust span measurement on the waistline, which is 4.5 inches, also on the chest line. Starting my measurement from the 1 inch for zipper allowance. Now on the chest line, I'll come down by 3 inches. You can come down by 2.5 inches if you like, and I'll make sure it's on the 4.5 inches. And I'll also be using 1 inch for the dart, so I'll mark ½ inch on both sides and create my dart. Now I'll be taking my circumference measurement. My bust circumference is 42, divided by 4 is 10.5 inches. Then I'll add 1 inch for side seam allowance. And my waist circumference is 36, divided by 4, that is 9 inches, plus 1 inch for that is 10 inches. So I'll mark 10 inches and I'll add 1 inch for side seam allowance. Now on the back half length line, I'll come in by ½ inch. You can come in by 3/4 inch or even 1 inch. It depends on how deep your back is, but I'll be using ½ inch, and I'll make a slant this way. Now you can as well mark the ½ inch on the waist line. That is another way of taking your back tightening, that's your zip tightening, to avoid zip bulge, and you make a slant this way also. So whichever works for you, you can be using this or this method or the other method. Now I'll do the same thing I did on the back piece. I marked 3.5 inches for my neck width, and I'll come down by 1 inch this way, and I'll connect it. Also from the armhole line, I'll come down by ½ inch like I did on the front piece, and I'll connect this ½ inch to this 3.5 inches. I'll make a curve for my back armhole. And for the depth of the neck, I'll be using 1 inch on the back piece. So I'll make a curve this way and I'll cut it out. I'll also cut the 1/2 inch for zip tightening this way, and my back piece is ready. Remember, I'll still be taking my 1 inch for zipper allowance, and I'll mark the dart on the other side on my fabric. So that is it. Now on the back piece, you can leave the armhole this way, but on the front piece, I'll be reshaping the armhole, because the front armhole is always deeper than the back. So I'll just make a curve this way. Depends on how deep you want it anyway. So I'll make a curve this way and I'll cut it. So this is how it is going to come out. So the front armhole is deeper than the back armhole. So I'll be cutting out a facing on the armhole area. So what I'll do is I'll place good sides of the fabric this way. Now I'll be using a tracing wheel to trace it out, just to show you how to cut out the facing. So I'll trace it out this way, and I'll determine how I want the length of the facing. You can use 2 inch or 1.5 inches. So this is how I'm going to cut out the facing. So after tracing it out on my fabric, I'll place good sides on each other this way, and I'll sew on 1/2 inch and turn it over. So I'll do the same thing on the other side and also on the back piece. Now I'll be drafting from the waist to this part, and I'll be using this pattern paper. So I've marked my waistline, and from the waistline I'll be taking my waist to hip point, which is 9 inches. So after doing that, I'll mark the length of the middle part, which is 13 inches. Now on my hip point, I'll come up by 1.5 inches. You can as well come up by 2 inches or even 3 inches, depends on how well you want the shape to come out. So I have 7.5 inches now for my hip point, so I'll mark 7.5 inches and 13 inches. So I'll be adding a dart also on the middle part. So I'll mark my bust span measurement, which is 4.5 inches, and the length of the dart I want is 5 inches. So I'll make sure it is at 4.5 inches. So I'll make a straight line, and I'll be using 1 inch for my darts. I'll mark 1/2 inch on both sides and create my darts. After doing that, I'll be taking my circumference measurement. My waist circumference is 36 inches divided by 4 is 9 inches. I'll add 1 inch for that is 10 inches. So I'll mark 10 inches and I'll add 1 inch for side seam allowance, that is 11 inches. So on this line, I'll mark my hip circumference divided by 4, that is 11 inches, and I'll add 1 inch for side seam allowance, that is 12 inches, and that is it. So after doing that, I'm going to connect this point to the edge of this point, that is the full length. So I'll make a slant line this way, and I'm going to add 1/2 inch that I'll use to join to the lower part. Now I'll cut this out. So the middle part is ready. I forgot to add 1/2 inch on the waistline that I will use to join to the upper part of the dress. So I'll be adding 1/2 inch on my fabric. I'll add 1/2 inch when I am cutting it out on my fabric. So this is the front piece, and I'll also be using this as a pattern to cut out the back piece. All I need to do is on the fabric, if I want to cut out the back piece, I'll leave 1 inch for zipper allowance, and that is it. Also on this front piece, I used 5 inch for that, but on the back piece, I'll be using 6 inch for that, and that is it. So I'll be using this silk fabric that is just 2 yards, and the length is by 60. And the length of the dress I want to make is 43 inches. So I have cut it out on the fabric. And I did not forget to add the 1/2 inch on the waist for joining allowance, and I added 1 inch for zipper allowance. So this is it. I have marked the dart on both sides of the fabric on the middle part, and this is the back piece. I've also marked the dart. I'll be taking in the dart. On the front piece also, I have marked the dart. As you can see, and I'll also be taking in the dart. Also on the back piece, I did the same thing. I have marked the dart, and I'll also be taking in the dart. Now on the middle part of the dress, I'll also divide it into 2. That is the back piece for my zipper allowance. So that is it. I'll go and take in the dart and come back and show you. Also, I made a bias for the neck that I'll use to finish up the neckline, and the length is 1.5 inches. So I marked the middle part and I folded both sides to create a bias. So you can use your bias tape if you like. I just want to use the fabric. So I've done that. I took in the dart on both on the back piece and the front piece. And I have also cut out the facing for the armhole. So I'll go ahead and place good sides on each other this way. I'll align it and pin it down, and I'll sew by 1/2 inch, and I'll do the same thing on the back piece. So I have done that. The next thing I'm going to do is I'll notch the edge so that when I iron it, it will be flat. So I'll notch the edge on the front piece and also on the back piece. So I'll be using this hemming gum on it. I'll first iron it this way, and I'll turn it over, and I'll put the hemming gum in between and iron it. So I have done that, and this is how it came out. So the next thing I'm going to do is to join the upper part and the middle part together. So I'll place good sides on each other this way on the back piece, and I'll pin it down. I'll make sure the darts are aligned. I'll pin it down and I'll sew by 1/2 inch, and I'll do the same thing on the front piece. I'll make sure I align the darts. So I have done that. I've joined the waist and I ensure the darts are aligned both on the front piece and the back piece. So the next thing I'm going to do is to join the back together. So I'll place good sides on each other this way, and I'll mark where I want my zip to stop. That is 21 inches. I've marked that already. So I'll sew down from the 21 inches. I've done that. As you can see, and the next thing I'm going to do is to attach my zip. Now to do that, I'll place good side of the zip on good side of the fabric on the 1 inch I left for zipper allowance. I'll pin it down this way and I'll sew it. And when I am sewing it, I'll make sure this waist area are aligned. So I have done that, and I ensure the waist area are aligned. Now the next thing I'm going to do is to join the front and the back piece together. So I'll place good sides on each other this way. I'll pin it down. I'll make sure the waists are aligned. I'll pin it down and I'll be sewing on the 1 inch I left for side seam allowance. So I have done that. As you can see, it came out really neat. So the next thing I'm going to do is to finish up the neck with the bias tape I made. And the length of the bias is about 26.5 inches. So I'll bring down the zip this way, and from one side of the back piece, I'll place my bias tape this way. That is good side of the bias on the wrong side of the dress. I'll start from 1/2 inch. That is, I'll leave 1/2 inch at the beginning and I'll fold it over this way on the edge of the dress. So I'll pin it down. So when I get to the end of one side of the back piece, I'll mark 3 inches. I'll mark 3 inches this way. So I'll place the 3 inches on the front piece this way. I'll make sure it is at the 3 inches and I'll pin it down. So I'll pin it down all through the front piece on one side of the bias. So when I get to the middle of the front piece, I'll just gather it a little. You don't have to do that anyway. Also, when I get to the end of the front piece, I'll also mark 3 inches. And from the 3 inches, I'll make sure it's at the 3 inches and I'll pin it down on the other part of the back piece. And when I get to the edge, I'll also fold in 1/2 inch this way and I'll sew it together. So I'll go and sew it round, that is on one side of the bias, and I'll come back and show you. So I've done that. And this is the 3 inches I left in between. And also the tiny gathers I made at the front. Remember, you don't have to do this. Now I'm going to bring out the edge this way. And I'll fold it this way. I'll make sure I push in all the raw edges. And I'll top stitch it with the bias on the good side of the neckline. So I'll go ahead and pin it down first and top stitch it. So I've done that and I made sure I top stitch neatly. So I'll be making the length of this dress 43 inches. So I used 17 inches from the shoulder to the waist and 13 inches from the waist to the middle part, that is 30 inches. So I'll be making the gathers on the lower part 13 inches and I'll add 2 inches for hemming allowance. So I'll measure the lower part. So what I have here is 52 inches. Now you can multiply whatever you have by 2.5 or 3. Depends on how full you want the gathers on the lower parts. So this is the rest of my fabric and I had to join it together because I want the gathers to be really full. So this is 143.5 inches. So I'll be using it that way. The next thing I'll do is I'll use the longest stitch on my sewing machine to sew on 1/2 inch all through the 143 inches and I will gather it. So I've done that and I will gather it. So I finished gathering it and I made sure it is up to 52 inches and I left 1/2 inch on both sides. So I'll turn it this way, good sides facing each other, and I'll sew on the 1/2 inch I left to join it together. So I've joined it and now I'll be attaching it to the dress. So I'll place good sides on each other this way. That's the part I sewed and the zipper part. I'll pin it down and I'll sew by 1/2 inch around the dress. So I've done that and this is how beautiful it came out. And I've also hemmed the lower part with the 2 inch I left for hemming allowance. So this is it. So we have come to the end of this tutorials, guys. If this was helpful, kindly give it a thumbs up and don't forget to click on the subscribe button and also turn on the notification bell to be updated when I upload a new video, because I have loads of interesting tutorials for you guys. Thank you for watching. Bye.